In the middle of the 16th century, there was one place on Earth that mattered more to global finance than any royal court, battlefield, or trading floor. It was not London. It was not Amsterdam. It was a ship dock in the southern Spanish city of Seville. This harbor was the financial heartbeat of the Western world. And every few months, all of Europe held its breath, waiting for a single moment. The moment when the sails of the Flota de Indias, the treasure fleet, returning from the Americas, finally appeared on the horizon. When they did, a collective sigh of relief swept across the continent. These ships were not simply carrying goods. They were carrying the economic lifeblood of an entire civilization. Deep in their holds were bars of silver stacked like firewood, chests overflowing with gold coins, pearls harvested from the Caribbean, and emeralds torn from the Andes. The sheer volume of wealth was almost incomprehensible. In a single good year, Spain could import enough precious metal to double the existing money supply of the rest of Europe combined. Seated inside the austere granite palace of El Escorial, just outside Madrid, the King of Spain was arguably the richest man to have ever lived since the age of the Roman Caesars. His empire stretched across the globe from the Philippines in Asia to Flanders in Europe, from Naples to Mexico City. It was an empire on which the sun quite literally never set. But Spain did not merely possess money. Spain possessed the source of money. The crown controlled the legendary mountain of Potosi, in modern-day Bolivia, geological anomaly, so rich in silver that contemporaries believed it was practically made of solid metal. The Spanish Habsburgs did not just own gold and silver. They owned the mines that produced them. In effect, they held a license to print the global reserve currency of the 16th century. And yet, this is not a story of triumph. It is perhaps the greatest financial morality tale in human history. Because the same king sitting atop that mountain of silver was not prosperous. He was broke. Not merely short of cash, but catastrophically, ruinously, and perpetually in debt. The paradox is so extreme that it sounds fictional. The empire that controlled almost all the money in the world could not pay its own bills. Between the mid-16th and the late 17th centuries, the Spanish crown formally declared sovereign default national bankruptcy 9 separate times. 9 times, the richest empire on earth told its creditors that it had nothing left. This story defies common sense. How do you starve while sitting at a banquet? How do you go bankrupt when your income consists of digging money directly out of the ground? The answer lies not in a lack of gold, but in a fatal misunderstanding of what wealth actually is. That misunderstanding turned Spain's golden blessing into a curse. It hollowed out its domestic economy, annihilated its middle class, and condemned the empire to a slow, agonizing decline while nations with far fewer resources rose to take its place. This is the story of how Spain became the first great victim of what modern economists would later call the resource curse. An empire that did not collapse because it lacked money, but because it choked on its own treasure. To understand the scale of Spain's eventual disaster, we first need to understand the scale of the miracle that preceded it. Before the discovery of the Americas, Spain was not a wealthy country. It was not a commercial powerhouse. It was not an industrial innovator. In fact, by the standards of late medieval Europe, Spain was relatively poor. The Spanish kingdoms had only recently been unified through dynastic marriage and the conclusion of the reconquisted the centuries-long struggle to expel Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula. The country's economy was overwhelmingly agrarian. It exported wool, mined some iron, and produced excellent soldiers, but little else. Its cities were modest. Its manufacturing base was thin. Its financial institutions were underdeveloped. Spain was a peripheral European power, not a dominant one. Then, almost overnight, history detonated. In Ihuarillo, Hernan Cortes overthrew the Aztec Empire in Mexico. Just over a decade later, Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire in Peru. These were not poor societies. They were ancient civilizations that had been accumulating gold and silver for centuries, treasures not as money in the European sense, but as symbols of divine and imperial power. The initial loot seized by the conquistadors was staggering. Temples were stripped. Royal treasuries were emptied. Entire rooms were melted down into bullion. But this was only the beginning. What Spain had captured was not merely treasure, it was access. In 1545, a native Andean herder named Diego Gualpa made a discovery that would change the world economy forever. High in the Andes, he stumbled upon a mountain rich in silver, or the locals called it Potosi the Rich Hill. They were not exaggerating. Potosi turned out to be the largest silver deposit ever discovered in human history. Not just a mine, but a geological absurdity. A mountain so saturated with silver that it seemed inexhaustible. The Spanish crown moved immediately. What followed was not small-scale extraction, but one of the first truly industrial mining operations in history. Entire cities were built in the clouds. Roads, refineries, and supply chains stretched across continents. To power this machine, Spain imposed the meta-system forced labor drafted from the native population. Hundreds of thousands of indigenous workers were compelled to toil in lethal conditions, dragging silver from the earth at an unimaginable human cost. Many never returned. The output was astronomical. For more than a century, rivers of silver flowed from Potosi to the Pacific coast or shipped north to Panama. Hauled across the isthmus by mule train, loaded onto massive treasure galleons, and sent across the Atlantic to Seville under heavy armed escort. This was not a trickle of wealth. It was a flood. Before this moment, Europe had suffered from a chronic shortage of hard currency. Gold and silver were scarce. Trade was constrained. Economic growth was throttled, not by ideas or labor, but by the simple lack of money to facilitate exchange. Spain did not just end this shortage, it obliterated it. In the span of a single generation, Spain transformed a continent-wide monetary famine into a monetary feast. And in doing so, it gained something no empire before it had ever possessed: effective control over the world's money supply. But hidden inside this miracle was the seed of catastrophe. Because while Spain had acquired unimaginable quantities of precious metal, it had not acquired the economic structure needed to use it wisely. And that misunderstanding about what money could do and what it could not would soon turn abundance into collapse. The flood of silver pouring into Spain did not simply change its balance sheet. It reshaped how Spanish rulers understood the world. In the 16th century, economic science as we know it did not exist. There were no GDP figures, no productivity metrics, no central banks tracking output or inflation. Instead, European rulers operated under a simple and deeply flawed theory known as mercantilism. Mercantilism held that a nation's wealth was measured by the amount of precious metal it possessed. Gold and silver were not just symbols of prosperity, they were prosperity. If a kingdom had full vaults, it was rich. If those vaults were empty, it was poor. The logic felt obvious, intuitive, and undeniable. And no state appeared to confirm this theory more perfectly than Spain. The Spanish monarchs, first Charles V and later his son, Philip II, looked at the mountains of silver arriving from the Americas and concluded that their wealth was effectively limitless. With Potosi under their control, they believed they had secured permanent prosperity. To them, the empire had solved the economic problem forever. What they failed to understand was something deceptively simple. Gold and silver are not wealth. They are markers of value, not value itself. True wealth is the productive capacity of a society. It is the ability to grow food, manufacture goods, build ships, weave cloth, refine tools, and innovate new techniques. A pile of gold sitting on a desert island is worthless. It only becomes valuable when someone else produces something you can exchange it for. Spain had the gold, but it did not have the things to buy. The domestic Spanish economy remained fundamentally medieval. Agriculture was inefficient and dominated by large feudal estates. Manufacturing was small, fragmented, and technologically stagnant. Urban crafts existed, but they lacked scale and competitiveness. Spain had not built the economic foundations needed to absorb a sudden explosion of purchasing power. Then the silver arrived. An undeveloped economy was flooded with an ocean of cash. And when too much money chases too few goods, the outcome is not prosperity. It is inflation. What followed in Spain was the first large-scale historical example of what modern economists would later call the resource curse, or Dutch disease. A nation blessed with extraordinary natural resources experiences a surge of income but, instead of strengthening the economy, that surge distorts it, weakens domestic production, and leaves the country poorer in the long run. Spain had discovered unimaginable wealth, but it had mistaken money for prosperity. And that confusion would soon unravel the entire empire. To understand how Spain's silver transformed from a blessing into a weapon against itself, it helps to strip the story down to its basic mechanics. Imagine a small town where, overnight, everyone wins the lottery. Every household suddenly has piles of cash. People rush out to buy better homes, nicer clothes, more food, and more services. But the town itself has not changed. It still has the same number of carpenters, the same tailors, the same farmers, and the same bakeries as before. Demand explodes, supply does not. The result is inevitable. Prices skyrocket. The carpenter can now charge 10 times his old rate because everyone can afford to pay it. The tailor raises prices. The farmer raises prices. Cash becomes abundant, but goods remain scarce. This is precisely what happened to Spain, except on a continental scale. As the treasure fleets arrived year after year, the amount of money circulating within Spain surged. Silver poured into royal coffers, into noble estates, into cities and ports. But the country's ability to produce food, clothing, tools, and manufactured goods did not increase at the same pace. Too much money began chasing too few goods. The result was the price revolution of the 16th century. Across Spain, the cost of living rose relentlessly. Food, rent, clothing, weapons, everything became more expensive. Over the course of the century, prices in Spain increased by roughly 400%. By modern standards, this may not sound extreme. But in a pre-industrial world where prices had remained largely stable for centuries, it was an economic earthquake. Wages lagged behind, fixed incomes collapsed, savings evaporated. But inflation did more than make life expensive. It quietly destroyed Spain's competitiveness. As prices rose inside Spain, Spanish goods became dramatically more expensive compared to those produced elsewhere in Europe. A bolt of wool cloth woven in Segovia might cost 2 or 3 times as much as a similar bolt produced in England or the Netherlands. For Spanish consumers, the choice was obvious. They used American silver to buy cheaper foreign goods. French tapestries, Italian armor, English textiles, Dutch grain. Spain imported them all. The silver extracted from Potosi did not stay in Spain. It passed straight through the country like water through a sieve, flowing outward into the hands of merchants and manufacturers in London, Amsterdam, and Paris. In effect, Spain was exporting its inflation to the rest of Europe. At the same time, it was strangling its own industries. Why invest in building a factory in Spain when it was cheaper to import the finished product? Why risk capital in manufacturing when foreign producers could always undercut domestic prices? Entrepreneurs looked elsewhere. Crafts collapsed. Workshops closed. The Spanish middle class, artisans, merchants, and manufacturers who formed the backbone of any healthy economy, was crushed. They could not compete with imports, and inflation destroyed the value of their savings. What remained was a hollowed-out society. At the top stood a small, immensely wealthy aristocracy living off imported luxury goods. At the bottom was a vast, impoverished peasantry struggling with rising prices. In between, there was almost nothing. Spain had become rich in money, and poor in everything else. If inflation and deindustrialization were slowly hollowing out Spain's economy, war finished the job. The Spanish Habsburgs did not see themselves as ordinary kings ruling a single country. They believed they were something far grander, the defenders of Catholicism, the guarantors of dynastic order, and the rightful masters of Europe. Their empire was not merely territorial, it was ideological. At the center of this vision stood Charles V, who ruled Spain in the first half of the 16th century. He was not only King of Spain, but also Holy Roman Emperor, a title that carried immense obligations. In theory, Charles was responsible for the defense and stability of most of Central Europe. In practice, this meant constant, exhausting, and ruinously expensive war. For nearly 40 years, Charles V lived in the saddle. He fought France for dominance in Italy and Western Europe. He battled the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe to halt the spread of Islam. And most destructively of all, he fought the Protestant princes of Germany during the Reformation, attempting to preserve Catholic unity in a rapidly fracturing continent. At the worst possible moment, warfare itself was changing. The 16th century saw a military revolution. Feudal levies knights, who served for short periods without pay, were disappearing. In their place rose professional standing armies, equipped with firearms, artillery, and disciplined formations. Massive trace Italian fortresses dominated the landscape. Navies grew larger, more complex, and more expensive. Spain's famous infantry formations, the tercios, were the finest soldiers in Europe. They were disciplined, experienced, and terrifyingly effective, but they expected to be paid. Cannon foundries, naval dockyards, global supply lines, fortification networks, and tens of thousands of salaried soldiers consumed vast amounts of money. The cost of maintaining Spain's military commitments would have strained even a healthy, industrialized economy. Spain had neither. American silver poured in, but it poured out just as fast. No matter how much treasure arrived from the New World, it was never enough. War devoured everything. To sustain this global conflict, Charles V turned to deficit spending on a monumental scale. He borrowed heavily from Europe's most powerful financial dynasties, the German banking houses of the Fuggers and Welser, and later the Genoese financiers who would come to dominate Spanish credit. These bankers were willing to lend because Spain appeared to have perfect collateral: the silver mines of the Americas. Charles signed contracts known as Asian Toes short-term, high-interest loans backed by future deliveries of treasure. In effect, he was spending money that had not yet been mined, mortgaging the future income of the empire to pay for the wars of the present. As long as the silver kept flowing, the system appeared sustainable. But it was a dangerous illusion. By the time Charles V abdicated in 1556, worn down and defeated by his inability to crush Protestantism, he left his son Philip II not a stable empire, but a financial time bomb. Spain ruled half the world, and it was already drowning in debt. When Charles V abdicated in 1556, he handed his son Philip II the greatest empire on earth. He also handed him its bills. Philip inherited a realm that stretched across continents, commanded the world's most feared army, and controlled the richest mines ever discovered. But behind the grandeur lay a brutal financial reality. The crown was already burdened with roughly 20 million ducats of debt, an astronomical sum for the era. Worse still, this was not abstract debt. Nearly every ducat of future revenue had already been promised to creditors. The silver that had not yet arrived in Seville had already been spent in the minds of Europe's bankers. Spain's finances were operating permanently in the future tense. Philip II was not an incompetent ruler. In many ways, he was the opposite. He was a tireless micromanager who worked 14-hour days, personally reviewing documents, correspondence, and accounts. He was deeply religious and sincerely believed that he ruled by divine mandate. And it was precisely this sense of duty that would ruin him. Philip saw himself as the champion of Catholicism in an age of heresy. Compromise, to him, was not policy, was sin. This conviction pulled Spain into two conflicts that would drain its treasury beyond recovery. The first was the Dutch Revolt. The Netherlands were the commercial and industrial engine of Spain's European empire. They were wealthy, urbanized, and deeply enmeshed in global trade. They were also increasingly Protestant. When Philip attempted to impose religious uniformity and tighter imperial control, the provinces rebelled. Philip responded with force. He sent his finest generals and the feared army of Flanders to crush the rebellion. What he expected to be a short, decisive campaign turned into an 80-year war of attrition, one of the longest and most expensive conflicts in European history. The Netherlands became a financial black hole. Men, supplies, and silver vanished into it year after year, with no decisive victory in sight. The second disaster was Philip's confrontation with Protestant England under Queen Elizabeth I. Religious rivalry, piracy, and geopolitical competition escalated into open war. In 1588, Philip committed to one of the most ambitious military projects of the age, the Spanish Armada. It was a massive investment, hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, and enormous logistical costs. The plan was to invade England and restore Catholic rule. The result was catastrophe. English fire ships, poor coordination, and violent North Sea storms shattered the Armada. Ships sank. Crews drowned. Treasure vanished beneath the waves. The investment was unrecoverable. By this point, Spain's finances were operating on a knife edge. The entire system depended on the punctual arrival of the treasure fleets. When silver arrived on time, the crown could pay its troops. When it didn't, everything collapsed. Storms delayed ships. Privateers captured fleets. In 1628, the Dutch famously seized an entire treasure convoy. Each disruption sent shockwaves through Spain's military and financial system. When the money failed to arrive, soldiers were not paid. When soldiers were not paid, they mutinied. The Army of Flanders erupted in repeated mutinies, often turning on the very cities they were meant to defend. The infamous Spanish Fury at Antwerp in 1576, when unpaid Spanish troops looted and burned one of Europe's richest cities, was not a failure of discipline. It was a symptom of insolvency. The collision between endless war, structural economic weakness, and crushing debt left Philip II with no options left. The first bankruptcy was no longer a question of if, only when. When we hear the word bankruptcy today, we imagine collapse. Companies shut their doors, assets are seized, control is lost. But in the 16th century, when a king went bankrupt, something very different happened. Spain did not fall apart when it defaulted. Instead, it simply stopped paying. A Spanish bankruptcy was not the end of the state. It was a suspension of payments. The king would issue a royal decree announcing that the crown could no longer meet its financial obligations. Interest payments on outstanding loans, especially the short-term Asian-toes, were halted immediately. The first great shock came in 1557, at the very beginning of Philip II's reign. Despite unprecedented silver revenues, debt servicing costs had become unbearable. The crown's income was devoured by interest before it could even reach the army or the navy. Faced with insolvency, Philip did the unthinkable. He simply stopped paying. The primary victims were the great German banking houses, especially the Fuggers of Augsburg, who had financed Charles V's wars for decades. The announcement sent shockwaves through Europe's financial centers. Credit froze. Exchange rates swung violently. The Fugger Empire itself teetered on the edge of collapse. But Spain had one overwhelming advantage. It was too big to fail. The bankers could not seize Spanish territory. They could not shut down the empire. And they could not afford Spain's total collapse because they were already deeply entangled in its finances. A ruined Spain would ruin them as well. So they negotiated. Typically, these bankruptcies ended not with full repayment, but with forced restructuring. Short-term high-interest loans were converted into long-term low-interest government bonds known as juros. The lenders lost enormous sums in expected profits, but in exchange, they received steady reduced income over time. The king gained something far more valuable: breathing room. With the immediate pressure relieved, Spain could begin borrowing again. And because it still controlled the silver mines of the Americas, new lenders eagerly stepped forward. After 1557, the German bankers gradually retreated, replaced by the increasingly dominant Genoese financiers, who believed they could manage Spanish risk more effectively. Thus began a deadly cycle. Spain would borrow heavily to fund war. The debt would spiral out of control. The crown would declare bankruptcy to wipe the slate clean. Then new bankers would step in, convinced that this time would be different. It never was. Philip II defaulted again in 1575, a massive cancellation of debt that directly triggered the mutinies in the Army of Flanders. With Spanish credit frozen, Philip could not send money north. Soldiers went unpaid. Antwerp burned. A third default followed in 1596. As the costs of the Armada disaster and intervention in the French Wars of Religion emptied the treasury once again. By the end of Philip II's reign, Spain had normalized bankruptcy as a tool of governance. Default was no longer an emergency measure. It was part of the system. The empire survived each collapse, but each one left it weaker. When Philip II died in 1598, he left behind a grim paradox. He had received more gold and silver than almost any ruler in history, yet he handed his successors a kingdom that was poorer, weaker, and more indebted than the one he had inherited. The 17th century would transform that paradox into a slow-motion catastrophe. The kings who followed Philip III, Philip IV, and finally Charles II were not men of Charles V's ambition or Philip II's discipline. They inherited a broken system and lacked either the capacity or the will to repair it. But even had they been stronger rulers, the structural problems facing Spain were now overwhelming. The first warning sign was in the Americas. The rivers of silver from Potosi began to slow. The richest surface veins had already been exhausted. Deeper mining required more capital, more technology, and more labor. At the same time, the indigenous population forced to work the mines was collapsing under the weight of disease, brutality, and overwork. Silver output declined. Spain's expenses did not. The wars continue, especially the catastrophic 30 Years' War in Central Europe. Spain felt compelled to fight alongside its Austrian Habsburg cousins, pouring men and money into a conflict that consumed entire generations and offered little strategic return. As revenue fell and spending remained unchecked, bankruptcies came faster and cut deeper. Spain defaulted again in 1607, 1627, 1647, 1652, and 1662. Each default was a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. By the mid-17th century, Spain's financial system was in shambles. Credit was scarce. Confidence was gone. The crown, desperate for liquidity, turned inward. It began to debase its own currency. The government minted coins made largely of copper, known as vellon, and forced the Spanish population to accept them at face value. Real silver coins were hoarded or shipped abroad to pay foreign creditors and fund armies. Inside Spain, bad money drove out good. The result was domestic inflation bordering on monetary chaos. Prices surged. Bread riots erupted. Trust in money itself eroded. The internal economy, already weakened by decades of neglect, collapsed further. Trade shrank. Investment vanished. Economic life retreated into subsistence. The consequences spread beyond Spain. The great Genoese banking families, who had grown fabulously wealthy financing Spanish debt for more than a century, were dragged down as well. The 1627 bankruptcy was particularly devastating. marking the effective end of Genoa's dominance as Europe's financial hub. Spain had become toxic. No one wanted to lend to it anymore. By the time Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, neared the end of his reign, the empire was little more than a shell. The army that had once terrified Europe was underpaid, under-equipped, and often non-existent in practice. The treasure fleets that once arrived like clockwork now came sporadically, if at all. The empire still existed on maps, but economically it was already dead. By the time Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died in 1700, the illusion was finally impossible to maintain. The empire that had once terrified Europe was a rotting carcass. Its army, once the most disciplined and feared fighting force on the continent, was now a shadow of itself. Chronically unpaid, poorly equipped, and hollowed out by decades of neglect. Fortresses crumbled. Ships lay idle. Entire regiments existed only on paper. The legendary treasure fleets, which had once arrived in Seville like the beating heart of the global economy, were now rare and unreliable. When they came at all, they carried far less silver than before. The mountain of Potosi had been bled dry. And when the silver finally slowed to a trickle, Spain discovered a terrible truth. There was nothing underneath. The domestic economy was non-existent. Manufacturing had never been rebuilt. Agriculture remained inefficient and feudal. Trade networks had withered. Spain, the country that had once owned the money of the world, ended the era as one of the poorest and most backward nations in Western Europe. This was the ultimate tragedy of the Spanish Empire. Its gold was not merely wasted. It was addictive. Because Spain could always dig up more money, it never felt the pressure to reform. It did not need to build competitive industries because it could buy finished goods. It did not need to modernize agriculture because it could import grain. It did not need to develop financial institutions or efficient taxation because silver solved every short-term problem. Easy wealth anesthetized reality. For more than 150 years, Spain postponed reform, innovation, and adaptation. And every year of delay made eventual collapse more severe. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, a very different story was unfolding. England and the Dutch Republic did not have silver mountains. They were starved of precious metals. And because they could not simply buy what they needed, they were forced to create it. They developed modern banking systems. They built stock exchanges. They improved agricultural productivity. They invested in shipbuilding, trade, and manufacturing. They constructed economies based not on extraction, but on production. Ironically, much of the silver that financed this transformation came from Spain itself. The metal that flowed out of Potosi ended up in Amsterdam and London, where it funded the foundations of the modern industrial world. Spain supplied the money, others built the future. When the silver finally ran out, Spain was left with debt, decline, and memories of past glory. But its rivals were left with something far more valuable: a functioning economy. Spain's 9 bankruptcies remain one of history's clearest warnings. Money is not wealth. Resources are not prosperity. And an abundance of easy income without the institutions to manage it is not a blessing. It is a path to ruin. The rise and fall of the Spanish Empire is not just a historical curiosity. It is a lesson that repeats itself across centuries. Whenever nations mistake cash for capacity, income for productivity, and resources for strength, the ending is always the same. Easy money is often the most dangerous kind.